Um, Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this session on resistance is not futile, just poorly understood. My name is Adam Shu, and I just want to make sure I clock. Yep. I want to start with asking you a question. What are we resisting? What are we resisting? Well, I'm going to let you answer that. If you caught the title of my presentation, Resistance is Futile, if you're familiar with the sci-fi series Star Trek, right, The Next Generation, many of you know that that phrase is popularized by this show. For those of you that are not familiar with Star Trek and Next Generation, just quickly explain, there's a species known as the Borg that basically takes over entire worlds and they assimilate them into their culture. And their catchphrase is, resistance is futile and you will be assimilated. So my question to you is resistance futile? Should we just pretty much give up? I don't know, so let's find out. Why don't you go ahead, go into your app and answer this question. What is the one word you would associate with resistance to? Resistance to.
Make sure you're in the room called Adam.
Yeah, make sure you're in my room. That would be great. Let's see, switch over. Is it showing up? Yeah, can you activate it? Thank you. I thought I did. Ah, there you go. My computer is resisting me. Resistance to, there you go. Thank you. So go ahead and put in whatever word you choose, please. Use. There you go. I'm seeing it. Thank you. Okay. So we have about 20 people that have already responded to, I see. And I think this makes the point. I've already even heard some of you say it, resistance to change, right? So can we switch back over? All right. So if it's resistance to change, we need to talk about change before we could talk a little bit about resistance. So I Googled resistance to, and this is what came up, right? The number one predicted word when you type it in. There's a bunch of other things, but change is the topic here. So let's talk a little bit about change. First, proper introduction. My name is Adam Shu, as I mentioned before. I work for JP Chase as an organizational coach. And because I work for JP Chase, I apologize. I have to tell you that all views and opinions that I express up here are mine and mine solely alone, and not that of JP Chase. Thank you.
Jamie, thank you.
Yeah, Jamie wants to make sure I do that. So I have several identities that I have for myself. One is I am a change agent or change champion, as known. I'm also a change enabler, an educator, a coach. I'm also a change manager, somebody who has to own the change. So I'll go into each one for you. So this is what it looks like if you're a change agent. This is me over here. All right, and there's typically some executive that comes around and says, go and change my organization. Go ahead and transform it to something completely different, and this is what they expect. You know this is very, very painful. So that's my change agent identity, and I work for a transformation program group. But I also have a dual role as a educator and enabler to help change mindsets, to actually teach them some of the concepts that they've never heard before, like how do you help teams that are overburdened? How do you start seeing services in your organization? So I'm a Lean Kanban accredited trainer as well. So I have the opportunity to help my organization in that manner. I also have the opportunity to do it publicly as well. I'm also a change manager. I own a lot of change. Those are my 6 kids, thanks to my wonderful wife. Change and resistance to change happens a lot in my house. The most recent resistance has been technology. Um, the older kids, the older three, all have iPads because it's required for school. And ever since they've gotten those iPads, the bedtime has slipped way beyond the normal range. And I had to use a coercive approach to kind of make sure they went to bed. So I went out and bought a Google Mesh and automatically shut down the Wi-Fi. I'll talk a little bit about coercive change here in a minute, but that's what worked for me to manage that change. A lot of resistance. So my next question for you is, what is your identity? I shared with you my identity. There's a couple. You might have one that's primary. You might actually have dual roles here. But I'd like to find out, what is your identity? Okay. People start answering. So there's actually a lot more change agents and owners. Well, starting to switch here, but I expected the top line there would be a lot of trainers and coaches within this room. The reason why I asked the question is because I want you to think about it, think about change and resistance to change in your role, but also consider the other roles as you have to deal with change in your role, but you also have to maybe take a different perspective of some of the people that you're working with. So if you're a trainer and coach and you have to engage the owner, what are your approaches to change and how do you deal with the resistance? And how do you put yourself in their perspective on the way they're dealing with the change and the resistance in their teams, right? So consider that as we continue on. So let's delve into resistance and change. Let's go into change first. I'm going to share with you a couple of truths or just generally accepted facts about change, some strategies, some information about the scope of change, models of change, and principles. So let's start with the truths. Change is inevitable. It'll just happen. You can't avoid it as much as you want it to. God knows I do with my 6 kids, but they're growing every day. You just have to deal with it just like the sun rises in the east, right? Change is usually stimulated either internally or it's being done to you from external. You might have a motivation to actually want to change, or because of conditions outside, market, technology, life, change is happening to you and you're going to have to deal with it as well. We use the term change is constant, and that's pretty generally accepted. But when change isn't happening, there are periods of stability known as an equilibrium, right? So we have periods of change and then stability, change and stability. But in this world that we live in today, with as much that is changing with technology, the demand for innovation and more performance, the intervals have become smaller and smaller and smaller. We're seeing more change happening, and we see the frequency of it rising. And then whenever there's change, there's typically resistance. I know some people say, no, I've seen where there's no resistance, but usually there might be a lag. It might not be immediate right away, but if there's change and you force it underground, it'll just come right back. And usually it comes back in a stronger force, right? So usually change is hand in hand with resistance. So there's a couple of strategies with dealing with change. These are 3 typical ones. The coercive one, the one I shared with you about how I took care of making sure my kids went to bed, shut it down. Usually in a work environment, this does not work, right? This is a very push approach. People will basically push back as hard as you push them for the change. Another way is rational, right? So we try to motivate or at least try to persuade the change using new information or data. But this one's not too effective. The reason why is we're all human beings. And trying to persuade us, leading with data, for most of us does not work because we are creatures of intuition, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But trying to appeal only to the rational side of human beings is a very hard thing to do, and that's why it's not as effective. Let me give you an example. When the Surgeon General came out and said, "Hey, smoking is bad. It'll actually cause cancer." People who smoked didn't even care. Not only that, a couple months after, there was a spike in smoking. People began smoking. So, trying to convince people with data has its limits. Then there's the normative approach, also known as re-educative, where you try to appeal to people's needs and desires, try to make an incentive, and the benefit to this is there's long-term effects to it. So it actually becomes durable, but it's very hard. It takes a while. It takes a while before it actually sticks, right? And that's because you're trying to change people's behaviors, right? And you're motivating them. So there's a couple of challenges there. Let's talk a little bit about scope real quick. Those of you, and I saw a lot of people were trainers or change agents. You probably in your work environment hear executives use the words change and transformation interchangeably. But I'm showing you this, this continuum by White Burke from Organizational Change and Theory and Practice. He describes it more as a continuum. You have changes that are very small on the left-hand side, and then you have massive change on the other side. The very small changes are known as tinkering. Barely anybody notices, but they're very minute. Then you have change that actually may affect some processes, right? And may require some type of different type of collaboration. So that's actually a real change. And some of those changes add up to be something that could be called a transformation, but not all changes may be associated to a transformation. Then you have your transformation. Transformation is actually when you actually change the culture, the entire culture of your organization, the processes, the way people do things, the way they work, and that's large. And then the most extreme is complete metamorphosis, where you can't even recognize the previous organization the way that it was. So there's a continuum here, and the idea is that you're going from very small transactional changes all the way to transforming, right? So be careful of when you use the term change, that you're using the right scope and you're describing it closer to what it should be. Then let's talk a little bit about the models of change. Very similar to the change approaches. You have directive, basically just say this is what needs to happen. Now one thing I will mention here is that using the directive approach is not all bad. Sometimes there's a need for it. Depends on the situation you're in, right? Let's say you're dealing with a situation where Mother Nature's, working against you, and there's some, weather event or, forest fire. To change people's behavior to not go back into their homes when they shouldn't, you need to take a directive approach. There's a sense of urgency, right? Life is on the line. So there are appropriate times when directive, models work. And then you have your collaborative. The collaborative approach is actually getting all the stakeholders of the change to actually participate in making decisions for the change, right? So what do you get out of that? Obviously, you get a little bit more skin in the game. Everybody's reading Nassim Taleb's book right now, right? So you get skin in the game. People take ownership of the change that you're trying to implement. And then there's a combination. So you could use a combination of both directive and collaborative based on the context. And there's been some success with that. I'm going to cover one of the models with you, and this one is probably the most used one whenever the term change comes up. It's Kurt Lewins' three-step model. And basically what he describes is in order for change to happen, there's basically three phases that need to occur. And in this example, you're trying to go from point A to point B. Now I realize that this example, especially with a lot of Kanban professionals here, that's very prescriptive to assume that we're going to actually end up in point B. We actually might end up in point D or F. But the intent is to move away from point A, right? So we first have to deal with the unfreezing process. We have to get out of the mode we're in and begin getting into a new situation. Then we start getting into the phase of moving towards or moving away from where we are. And finally, once we get to where we want to be, we refreeze, right? We get all of those processes and ways and cultures that are now becoming normative, and you go back to refreezing. Lewin also shares that in order for change to happen, you need to account for two conflicting forces. This is known as Lewin's force field analysis. You have driving change, right? The force that's trying to make change happen, and then you have your restraining force, right? And in most cases, because most organizations, most individuals want to live in equilibrium, there's basically equal force happening right here, right? So you maintain status quo. In order for change to occur, one of these has to give way, right? Now you could take it from the left-hand side and say, let's apply more driving force. Now those of you that are familiar with forcing things, you get an equal opposite force when you push harder, right? So what's the other option? Let's deal with the left-hand side of this equation, right? Restraining. Let's find a way to actually minimize or weaken the restraining force, right? And maybe that will actually help change occur in a better way. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, and I don't know if there's sound. It should have sound. How many familiar with the movie Groundhog Day? It's one of my favorite movies, right? If you're not familiar with the movie, there's this character that's played by Bill Murray, Phil Connor, and he's living the same day over and over and over and over again. It's called Groundhog Day. And every day he walks down the street and he runs into this guy, Ned Ryerson, some guy that used to know him and used to go to school with him, and he's an insurance salesman. And every day he runs into him, the same thing happens. Ned wants to sell him insurance. And as much as Bill Murray's character tries to push him away and tries to say, get away from me, you know, he's becoming quite a pest, the harder he comes back, right? And then, so one of these days that repeats, Bill Murray comes up with a brilliant idea. Stop pushing on the driving force. Let me try working on the restraining force. Let's kind of weaken that side. And this is what he does. You can't hear it.
I gotta get going. Let's get the seat, Bill.
Thank you. So you see, sometimes not pushing is probably the best way to encourage change to happen. So in Lewin's model, he also talks about 3 preconditions that actually have to occur for change to actually happen. First, there has to be stress. Stress is actually it's actually what actually causes change to begin happening. Now, if you don't have stress, you're not going to have change. Simple as that. If you apply too much stress, you're going to have what's known as distress. And what do you think happens? The exact opposite, right? You're going to have more resistance to change, and you can't even get out of the freeze. What you need is what's known as eustress, and it's a Greek term. It's known as good stress, right? The type of stress that actually causes people to grow and learn and get out of their comfort zone. So it's just enough to actually get you there. That's one of the first preconditions. The second precondition is what's known as valence. Valence is attractiveness of the other option that you're looking at going to, right? So how attractive is it that it's going to allow me to move there? It may not be the attractor. It may be because you're trying to get away from point A, right? So you're only moving a little bit away from point A. So that's the second precondition. Then you need potency. Potency is the actual skill or the ability to actually change, right? To actually get to where you need to go. So it's those three preconditions. You need stress, use stress actually, good stress. You need valence, and then potency. So I just shared with you the Lewin model, three-step model, but there's plenty of change models out there that you could choose from. Maybe the more recent one that you're familiar with is Jim and Collins' Good to Great. It's the flywheel model. But again, all of these models could work, but they all kind of boil down to the same kind of structure. You have analysis, planning, strategizing, and then implementation. No matter which model you use, just make sure you do it thoughtfully, right? So, kind of to summarize our discussion here with change, there's a couple of principles of change. I'm not going to read them all out here, but I am going to maybe point out one or two. Whenever you have change, there's always a loss, right? So I've seen this firsthand. This had nothing to do with agile model or anything. This was to allow our teams to begin working in a collaborative space. Right? Our office has a lot of old configured furniture, very high walls, can't see each other, people are hiding in their desk. So our executive said, hey, can you just take down the wall so that we actually create some, people can see each other so we can communicate? And we did that. So we came up with the plan, an implementation date ready, and we were even so nice as to actually hold a open forum for everybody just to let them know what's going on, let them ask questions. And let me tell you, change like this becomes very personal. People feel a loss. Now, and again, this is people's workplace, right? This is temporary. People are just working there. We were heckled when this happened. People were very not happy about us changing their work environment. So much so, people were posting things on their cabinets. Do not touch this. I will report you. People take change very personally, and for them, it was a loss. So that was a very eye-opening story. Also, leadership, right? You need to have some leadership involved to kind of make sure that they create the right environment for change to occur, right? And we've seen this firsthand where leadership is not there or not there strong enough, and any change effort basically falls flat. So now that we've talked about change, let's talk about resistance, because they go hand in hand. I'm going to ask you first a few questions and talk about the factors, a little bit of psychology, and then a little bit about coaching for resistance. So your next question is, what do you think actually causes change resistance? What do you think causes change resistance? Thank you. Yep, they just activated it. Go ahead. See that fear getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so I think that makes the point. Just kind of keep note of those that you've called out. I'll share with you some of the key factors. You've pretty much did the job for me. A lot of these things that you're actually sharing about what actually causes change resistance are in fact what I'm going to be covering. Let's see. Ooh, can we deactivate the poll? Thank you. Sweet. All right, so factors of change resistance. Fear, that was the first one. That word got pretty big up there. Fear of failure, fear of suspicion, right? Where there's trust issues, maybe there's not enough trust with their leaders. Insecurity, it's kind of like talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Without any type of security, you can't even think about anything else, right? Loneliness, that's kind of a man on an island or a woman on an island, however you want to describe it. It usually happens when a boss goes on a trip, reads some executive journal, comes back and says, I've got something I want you to try, and you're the only one trying it. And you've got to deal with the change situation by yourself. That's very lonely. Ambiguity, we're not clear. Differential knowledge, not sharing information with people. Chaos, right? These are all fears. Reluctance factors, right? Increased burdens, like, do I really need to take on additional burdens here? There's no benefit to me. What's in it for me, right? Last time I supported a change, there was no recognition for me to actually support it. Lack of ownership, like, well, I didn't take part in this. I'm not going to support this change. Boredom. These are the people that are already checked out, right? So they don't even want to talk about change. Keeping status quo, right? People, we're human beings. We love being in the comfort zone. Sudden wholesale change comes along, and immediately we go into overdrive to oppose it. Inherited culture, anytime we have merging of cultures, right? The saying is, you don't just marry that person, you marry their family, right? You inherit that whole culture, right? Inertia. Inertia is one of the hardest things to overcome. Once you have an established process or culture, trying to turn that ship around is very hard. Lack of support, right? And what we're talking about here is leadership. So you might have leaders, named leaders actually, but they may be taking a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach, right? And then you have people who are newly named leaders that may be either unable to or unwilling to help because they may not have the right skill set yet, right? So we don't know. So these things may occur and actually may stifle any type of change and resistance. And just to name a few other resistance factor, judgment, right? This is especially dangerous for people who are in the change agent identity, right? We're going to come in, we're going to teach you, we're going to coach you. So how do you approach people who want change but not come across as judgmental, right? You have to have a little empathy on how we approach people. Damaged relationship, there's always baggage that you have to deal with. Extremes of org structures, right? So if an organization is highly centralized, so much bureaucracy, it's hard to overcome that bureaucracy. Or on the flip side, on the opposite side, you have absolutely no structure. You don't even know who the leader is. Very hard to make change on this side too, right? Another question for you. Is resistance good or bad? Is resistance good or bad? Pretty good. All right, thank you. So yeah, this is good. This is encouraging to see that people are either saying both or neither, because it depends on the context, right? And sometimes that has nothing to do with good or bad. It's just like change. Change happens. Change is inevitable. Resistance is also similarly inevitable, right? Once you have one, you have the other. Switch back. Thank you. The reason why I asked you this question is whether or not you knew it, you had some gut reaction to it, right? There's this guy by the name of Jonathan Haidt, right? Introduced to me by Mr. Patrick Sayre, sitting over there. Read this book, very enlightening. If you haven't read this book, it's a great book. He wrote the Righteous Mind. He wrote the Happiness Hypothesis and also the Righteous Mind. And in both books, he actually describes this. We as human beings make decisions in the metaphor of a rider and an elephant, right? The rider basically symbolizes our conscious reasoning. And our elephant here represents the unconscious intuition. So you see at the very bottom, what he says is, intuitions come first and strategic reasoning comes second. The reason why is because you may look at that rider and elephant and think, oh, it's the rider that's in control of the situation. The rider directs where the elephant goes. But in actuality, why he uses this metaphor is because the elephant is going where it wants to, and the rider is just there to support that decision, right? The reason is, and I asked you a question, what is, resistance good or bad? You had a gut feeling, you had an intuition that immediate, and that's how quick it is. You had an immediate response about either resistance or good or bad, and that's just one question. You make intuitive decisions all day long, and those you don't really sit there and reason, right? Should I have the coffee or should I have tea? You know what you want, right? So the metaphor here is the elephant is going to lean one way or the other, and the job of the rider is to actually be the spokesperson for why the elephant actually make that decision, right? Post hoc, right? So the elephant's going to turn right, and the rider's not even going to consider anything on the left. They're not even going to look at reasoning on this side. They're just going to focus on why did the elephant, and here's the reasons why we made this decision, right? There's also something that he talks about in the book is called effective primacy, and it's actually a concept that was way back in the 1800s that was proposed by Wilhelm Wundt, and later elaborated by Robert Zients. And basically what it says is effective primacy is basic feeling and reacting before you even evaluate, right? So this is the metaphor of the rider and the elephant. We make decisions based on our gut intuition all the time. Social persuasion. So what this actually tells us is, in order for us to actually begin trying to persuade people to change or actually overcome that resistance to change, you actually have to appeal to their elephant, not the rider, right? You have to appeal to people's intuition. You have to appeal to people's gut feeling. You have to appeal to people's using experience to actually help them understand the change and why it's happening, right? Because we learn from experience to affect our intuition that changes our behaviors. Remember I showed you earlier in one of these slides, if you try to lead with the approach of trying to reason with human beings, it's a very hard thing to overcome. But if you can appeal to their intuition, intuitive nature, you're actually going to open a lot of minds. This is why those of you that actually do provide training maybe know this. The most effective way to actually open people's mind is through experience, right? And that's why simulations are so powerful in a training environment, because they're actually getting that experience and learning why it is the things that they've never come across actually has a different point of view and something that they can learn from. If you just sit there and lecture at people through reasoning, probably just going to fall asleep. But experiences actually provokes emotions and actually engagement for learning. So again, intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. So I want you to start considering and thinking about looking at resistance a little bit differently. And I shared with you some information, but resistance, which is caused by a stressor, is a natural thing that happens, and it's needed for change, right? Just the right amount of stress. We want to tackle the resistance side by the reinforcement side by minimizing the restraining factors, right? Just think of Bill Murray's character, how he accomplished that. And then resistance occurs in every phase of change, right? So you should expect resistance to happen over and over again. If you know that as a fact, you can actually come up with a strategy for how you want to deal with it. But as long as you do it thoughtfully, right? At the end of the day, you're still dealing with human beings who are going to be affected by a change. I want to share with you one last person. Some of you may recall, I mentioned this in last year's talk, Robert Cialdini. He wrote 2 books, one on influence, and then followed it up with a book on persuasion. In the book Influence, he covers 6 principles of influencing people or persuading people, and they're through reciprocation, scarcity, authority, consistency, liking, and social proof. The one that I've seen most effective, or the most powerful one that I've seen work is social proof, right? Social proof is actually where you actually have real proof of a change occurring, and you allow people to share their stories and tell their stories, the good and the bad, so that people can experience it, right? So we talked a little bit about influencing the elephant through experience. You could also use other people's elephants to help affect people's understanding as well. So using social proof, other people's story, has a very useful part to play here in persuading. In the other book that he has, Persuasion, there's some key concept. You can persuade before you actually want to make people change their mind a little bit. You can use persuasive effect of building trust, right? There's also something called privileged moments, right? Let's say you did something really good for some executive, and then they turn to you and go, wow, that was fantastic. Do you have any other great idea? You actually have to be ready to come up with that next great idea. That's a privileged moment, right? So make sure to tee those up. And then there's a few others, but the last one I want to point out is in this book that he shares with you some of these great concepts of how to persuade, kind of thinking ahead, right? You gotta use them ethically, right? Don't use them for evil. So how does this tie in with the Kanban method, the change management principle, since we are at LKNA? Everything that I shared with you about change and resistance is tied to the way that the Kanban change management principles are laid out. And it's actually quite elegant, right? We all know the change management principles. Start with what you do now. Don't change roles or titles. Understand your current process, the way that it's practiced now. Gain agreement to pursue evolutionary change, and then encourage leaderships at all levels. So what does that look like when we map it back to everything we just talked about? Oops, going the wrong way. Looks like this. So we have change management. We got change principles. We talked about the resistance factors. You know, Jonathan Haidt's intuition over reasoning, and then persuasion and persuasion. Each one of these Kanban change management principles map really well to each one of these. You know, example, you have reducing restraining force under changing principles for start with what you do now, trying to bring the anxiety level down, right? Trying to appeal to intuition first when you say, hey, we're not going to change anybody's role here. Let's just start with understanding what you do now. You're appealing to their intuitive nature and not causing them and trying to sell them on the reasoning on why you should try Kanban, right? So I'm not going to read all of them, but you will have access to the slide. But the important part I want to share with you here is that consider change, right? Consider resistance. There's an opportunity there for us to actually look at it and say, you know what, we could actually be very effective if we can hone in on how we persuade people, right? And we need to speak to their intuitions. We need to speak to their emotional, gut reactions. And that's how we're going to actually affect people and thinking about things in a different way, beginning to see services in the workforce that that you're trying to coach them on, right? So this is my presentation, and thank you very much for your time.